At 8:51 on a Thursday morning, Officer Boyd Callum crossed the lobby of the Delwood City Police Department toward a quiet, older black man sitting on a bench near window 6, and in the 38 steps between where he started and where he stopped, he destroyed everything he had spent 6 years building. He did not know this yet. He was smiling. Boyd Callum had been on the force for 6 years. He had 4 excessive force complaints buried in a filing cabinet that no one with real authority had ever bothered to open. He had a union representative who answered his calls before the second ring and a deputy chief who had spent 4 years making his problems disappear the way smoke disappears quietly, completely, and without leaving anything behind that anyone had to account for. He had spent every one of those 6 years operating on a single, load-bearing assumption that the badge on his chest made him the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. He was right about almost everything, except that. He had absolutely no idea that the man he was about to spit on, the quiet, older black man in the worn gray sweatshirt sitting with his forearms resting on his knees and his eyes moving over the room in that particular way that looks like patience, but is actually something much more disciplined, was going to be sitting behind the chief's desk of his own department in 4 days. But this story does not start with Boyd Callum. It starts the night before in a modest apartment on the east side of Delwood City, when a 57-year-old man disabled his alarm clock for the first time in 28 years. Raymond Elias Cole woke naturally at 6:51 without a sound from anywhere in the apartment, demanding anything from him, and he lay still for several minutes in the gray-purple light that belongs only to the half hour before sunrise, that uncertain, quiet light that looks like the world considering whether to continue. He had seen this light 10,000 times from the other side of a windshield driving toward crime scenes and depositions and briefings that began before the precinct coffee had finished brewing. Watching it now from a horizontal position from the warmth of his own bed, in a city he was still learning the rhythms of, felt like a form of wealth he had not previously possessed and was not yet sure he deserved. He dressed without ceremony. Dark work pants worn soft from hundreds of washings, a gray sweatshirt from his son Marcus's college graduation 9 years old, fraying gently at the cuffs in the way that only time and actual use can produce, boots scuffed from real work. He looked at himself briefly in the hallway mirror and saw what anyone would see: an older black man in comfortable lived-in clothes, unremarkable, going about his morning. He saw the absence of the uniform. He saw the version of himself that existed when no one was watching, who he professionally was. On the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker, a framed photograph of his younger brother Jerome looked back at him. Jerome mid-laugh, arms wide the way he always stood in photographs, as though the world was something to be embraced rather than merely inhabited. Raymond looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he started the coffee. Mayor Sandra Briley of Delwood City had called Raymond directly through channels that bypassed the normal political machinery because she did not trust the normal political machinery to produce the chief she actually needed. The normal machinery produced chiefs who were good at managing appearances and protecting institutional relationships and explaining with great patience and carefully chosen words why things that should change could not yet change. She had had 3 of those chiefs in 12 years, and she was done with that particular variety of competence. She needed someone who had spent a career studying how police departments failed, not from the outside with reports and recommendations, but from the inside, where the actual decisions were made and the actual consequences were absorbed by actual people. She needed someone who understood intimately how misconduct was concealed, who had enough distance from Delwood's existing culture to cut through it without flinching, and who was, in her exact phrasing during their second phone conversation, too old to care about being liked and too experienced to be played. Raymond had listened to her describe the job and had said almost nothing in response because he was a man who understood that listening first was not a weakness but a discipline, and because what she was describing was not an offer he could evaluate quickly without being dishonest with himself about what it would actually require. He accepted after 72 hours of consideration and one brutally honest conversation with himself at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the kind of conversation that requires complete silence and the willingness to hear answers you were not entirely hoping to receive. His official start date was Monday, 4 days from now. Today was Thursday. Today was his. Mayor Briley's office had offered an escort for his visit to the department building, someone to smooth the path, announce his presence, ensure that his first interaction with the institution was properly managed. He had declined. He wanted to see the building the way a citizen saw it from the front alone, without anyone running ahead to adjust the lighting. He told himself this was professional instinct, the habit of a man who had spent 28 years learning that an institution reveals itself most clearly when it does not know it is being observed. Mostly, though, it was simpler than that. He was going to collect his brother's belongings. That was the whole of it, and he wanted to do it without it becoming something else. He dressed, drank his coffee at the kitchen table, and looked out the window at the street waking up below. A woman walked a dog past the building, moving at the particular brisk pace of someone who has somewhere to be, but is not yet late. A delivery truck idled at the corner, the driver doing something on a clipboard. Delwood City proceeding into Thursday with complete indifference to the fact that in 4 days Raymond Cole would walk into a building and assume command of an entire police department. He appreciated the indifference. It felt like the last quiet morning before a long stretch of mornings that would not be quiet, and he wanted to sit inside it for a little while before it was over. He finished his coffee, picked up his keys, and locked the door behind him. Jerome Cole had been 53 years old when he died 14 months ago. Now, a heart attack on an ordinary Wednesday morning that arrived without warning and without any of the signs that are supposed to precede these things. The fatigue and the tightening chest and the small accumulating signals that give a person time to prepare. There were no signals. Jerome went to bed on Tuesday night and did not wake up on Wednesday, and that was the whole of it, as sudden and as merciless and as impossible to understand as a sentence that ends in the middle of a word. He had lived in Delwood City for the last 11 years of his life. He had come here for work following a major infrastructure contract that brought him south from Chicago, and had stayed because the city had gotten into him, in the way that cities sometimes do, settling into the particular corners of a person's daily life until leaving feels like a kind of loss even when you haven't fully decided to stay. He worked as an electrical foreman overseeing crews on commercial projects across the city, the kind of work that required him to know how things were built and how they failed, and how to explain both with clarity and without condescension to people who needed to understand quickly. On Whitfield Avenue 3 evenings a week and most of Saturday morning he coached youth football for boys between 11 and 15 years old, boys from the neighborhood who needed somewhere to be and someone who would be reliably there. Jerome was reliably there. He had a quality that Raymond had never been entirely able to name, a gift for making people feel seen without making a production of it, so that the boys on his team understood without being told directly that someone with actual authority over his own life had looked at them and decided they were worth his Thursday evenings and his Saturday mornings. And he had the laugh. Raymond had been thinking about the laugh for 14 months with the particular quality of grief that attaches itself to things that cannot be reproduced, cannot be recorded with enough fidelity to actually carry what they carried in person, and cannot be replaced by any other sound in the world. Jerome's laugh was the loudest, most unself-conscious, most physically committed laugh that Raymond had ever encountered on a human being, the kind that made other people start laughing before they knew the joke, before they even knew there was a joke, simply because the sound of it was so genuinely joyful that the body responded to it instinctively. Jerome's truck had been impounded for a registration lapse 2 months before he died, the kind of administrative oversight that accumulates when a person is managing a full life, and too many things are being tracked in too many places, and something small slips through. The impoundment had produced a storage locker at the Delwood City Police Department where the contents of Jerome's truck had been transferred and cataloged and held waiting for someone with proper authorization to come and collect them. The locker had sat there through the grief and through the complicated business of the estate, through the weeks of paperwork and the phone calls and the particular exhaustion of administering the practical remnants of someone's life while also trying to absorb the fact of their absence. It had sat there through the months after all of that was nominally resolved, when Raymond had the legal authorization he needed, but not yet the specific emotional capacity to walk into a police department and carry out a cardboard box that contained the last physical remnants of his brother's daily life. He had that capacity now, or something close enough to it that he had decided to stop waiting for the precise version. The sealed envelope was in the inside pocket of his jacket. The authorization letter, the reference number, the name and address of the property storage office, everything in order, everything official. He had the address memorized. He would go to the building, collect the box, and be home by noon. He would put the box on the kitchen table next to Jerome's photograph, and he would open it when he was ready, and he would see what was inside. And it would be, whatever it was, the accumulated small objects of a man's working life, and he would hold them, and they would be his brother's things, and that would be enough. He did not know as he drove through the east side streets toward Meridian Avenue what the morning was actually going to cost. He was thinking about Jerome, about the last time they had spoken on the phone, about a conversation that had been ordinary and brief and full of the casual affection of two brothers who assumed there would be more ordinary brief conversations ahead. And he was listening to the radio at low volume, and the city was going about its morning, and it was a Thursday in early November. Cold and clear, and Raymond Cole had no idea. The Delwood City Police Department occupied a corner building on Meridian Avenue that had been constructed in the 1970s and renovated twice, since neither renovation having done quite enough to address the original structure's particular variety of institutional grimness. The exterior was brick and poured concrete, imposing and tired simultaneously, the way government buildings look when they have been asked to serve more functions than they were designed for, over a longer period than anyone initially planned. The American flag above the entrance hung stiff in the cold morning air. The steel letters spelling out the department's name were fixed to the facade, several of them slightly misaligned in a way that had long since stopped being noticed by anyone who worked there regularly enough to have stopped seeing the building and begun simply passing through it. Raymond parked in the visitor lot at 8:46 and sat for a moment before getting out, looking at the building through the windshield with the evaluating attention of a man who had spent his career learning to read institutions before he entered them. He had been to this building twice before, once for a walkthrough in his second week of conversations with Mayor Briley's office, and once for a brief meeting with the outgoing chief, a man named Hargrove, who had communicated through polite words and unmistakable body language that he believed the department was fundamentally sound and would benefit primarily from being left alone by people who did not understand the particular complexity of the work. Raymond had drawn his own conclusions from that meeting and from the 41 pages of departmental review that preceded it, and had kept those conclusions to himself because a man who arrives to his new command having already announced his judgments has given up the most valuable advantage available to him, which is the advantage of still being underestimated. Today he was not here in any official capacity. He was here for Jerome's box. That was the whole of it. The lobby communicated everything essential about the institution within the first 30 seconds of entry, the way lobbies always do when you know how to read them. Ceilings low, lighting fluorescent and too yellow, the particular shade that makes everyone look slightly worse than they actually feel. Floor linoleum scrubbed so many times the pattern had faded to a ghost of itself in the high traffic paths from door to counter. A long service desk ran the length of the far wall, divided into 6 numbered windows. A row of plastic chairs, the kind bolted together in groups of 3, formed a waiting area that was already 2/3 full at not yet 9 in the morning. Raymond found the bench near window 6, which had a small placard mounted on the wall above it, designating it as the waiting area for property storage and evidence retrieval, a function separate from the general service queue. The window's light was off the clerk, not yet at their post. He sat down, rested his forearms on his knees, and settled into the patient stillness that 28 years of police work had built into his constitution. Like load-bearing material, the ability to wait without agitation, without performing patience, without needing the situation to resolve itself faster than it was going to resolve. He watched the room the way he always watched rooms, without appearing to taking in the quality of the service interactions at the active windows, who got efficiency and reasonable courtesy, who got the flat impatience of people who had performed the same tasks long enough to have stopped seeing the individuals before them as individuals. He watched who was given the benefit of the doubt and who was not, and whether the difference correlated to the complexity of their business or to something else, something less easily named in an official report, but immediately legible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. He had been sitting approximately 7 minutes when he became aware of Officer Boyd Callum. Boyd Callum was 36 years old, wide through the shoulders, built with the specific solidity of a man who took the gym seriously and directed a considerable amount of personal energy into the effort, the kind of physical investment that can be about health or can be about something else depending on the person making it. His buzz cut was precisely maintained. His uniform was immaculate in the way that reveals not mere professionalism, but personal investment. Every crease sharp, every button perfectly aligned. His boots polished to a reflective shine that went beyond what the department's standards required. He carried a large, insulated coffee thermos in his left hand, with a casual possessiveness the way some men carry a tool they consider an extension of themselves rather than simply an object they are holding. He had a habit, Raymond noted immediately, of cracking the knuckles of his right hand against his left palm. Not nervously, not irregularly, but rhythmically, like a man tapping out a pattern that only he could hear, and that served some internal purpose he had never needed to articulate. Boyd moved through the lobby the way a man moves through space he considers his territory. Not hurrying, not performing at anything in particular, simply present in the way that people are present when they are entirely comfortable with the power dynamic of a room and have no reason to question whether it applies to them. His gaze moved over the space in a continuous low-level sweep that was neither warm nor curious. It was proprietary, the specific surveillance of someone cataloging the room for potential complications, assessing each element, not for its humanity but for its manageability. He did not consider himself a prejudiced man. This was important to understand about Boyd Callum because it was central to how he operated and central to why he had been able to operate the way he had for 6 years without meaningful correction. In his own internal language, he was realistic. He was experienced. He had street knowledge that people who spent their careers behind desks and in conference rooms would never develop, and he had learned over 6 years to trust that knowledge above other forms of information, including the kind that arrived in the form of a person asking him a direct question about his conduct. The complaints in his file, those were the cost of doing real police work. Any officer who was actually out there, actually engaging, actually making the difficult calls that kept a neighborhood like this one from sliding into chaos. Any officer doing that work accumulated paperwork. Only the ones who sat in their cars running out the clock had clean records, and Boyd had nothing but contempt for that variety of safety. When his eyes landed on Raymond, sitting quietly on the bench near window 6, older black man in a worn gray sweatshirt and work boots, forearms on his knees, his gaze moving over the room with that particular stillness that Boyd read as either waiting or watching, or some combination of the two that he did not find entirely comfortable. Boyd's sweep paused. Raymond met the look without expression and without looking away. He completed his assessment of Boyd Callum in approximately 2 seconds and registered the result with the part of his mind that had been registering these particular results for 57 years quietly, without drama, with the flat accuracy of long practice. 28 years as a police officer had added a layer of professional precision to that assessment, but the underlying recognition was older than his career and had nothing to do with rank. Boyd looked away first. He continued his circuit of the lobby, stopped at the service counter to exchange a word with the officer at window 2 in a tone too low to carry, then turned and stood near the entrance with his thermos and his rhythmic knuckle cracking, watching the room in the way that men watch rooms when they are looking for something to do with the authority they are carrying. 3 minutes later, he started walking toward Raymond. Raymond watched Boyd Callum cross the lobby toward him and thought about Jerome. He thought about Jerome's laugh specifically because Jerome had a gift that Raymond had always admired and never quite managed to replicate, which was the ability to find the precise humor in a moment of indignity and deploy it with such accuracy that the indignity deflated rather than expanded. Jerome could name the absurdity of a situation in 3 words, and make everyone within earshot, including Raymond, feel that the situation had lost some essential power over them simply by being named correctly. Raymond would have given something significant for his brother's company in that moment. Instead, he had the particular quality of his own stillness, which was a different tool, but one he had been practicing for considerably longer. Boyd stopped in front of him, cracked his knuckles once against his palm, and delivered the first line without greeting, without identifying himself, without any of the procedural courtesy that the department's own community policing guidelines nominally required of officers initiating contact with civilians in the station's public areas. He simply said in the flat declarative tone of a man who expects his statements to function as conclusions rather than openings, "You need to clear this area." Raymond did not move. He said in the voice that had spent 3 decades learning how to carry authority without raising its volume that he was waiting for the property clerk at window 6 and that he had business there. Something shifted in Boyd's face at this, a slight tightening at the jaw, a fractional narrowing of the eyes, the specific expression of a man who is accustomed to having his first statement end the conversation and who has just encountered a response that is treating it as a beginning instead. He told Raymond that this area was part of the service queue and that without a number there was no seat here. This was not accurate. The bench Raymond was sitting on was designated specifically by the placard directly above it on the wall as a waiting area for property storage and evidence retrieval, a separate function from the general service queue with its own window and its own designated waiting space. Raymond had read the placard when he sat down because Raymond Cole read signs. He inclined his head toward it slightly and told Boyd what it said. He told him that window 6 opened at 9 and that it was currently 8:52 and that he was simply early. Boyd glanced at the placard for a duration that made it genuinely ambiguous whether he read it. He looked back at Raymond and pointed to the general waiting area near the entrance and told him to move. Raymond reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced the sealed envelope, the authorization letter, with the reference number and all the necessary official information, and held it up simply, not as a challenge, but as the most direct possible evidence of the purpose that had brought him to this bench at this time on this morning. He said he had authorization for property retrieval, that he had the reference number, that the window opened at 9, and it was not yet 9, and he was going to wait here. Something harder settled into Boyd's face. He radioed for a second officer, and 2 minutes later, Officer Sean Merritt arrived, 24 years old, with a face that still registered what it encountered, rather than having learned to process it behind professional distance. Merritt took in the scene, Boyd standing over the seated man, the man unhurried and calm, and his eyes moved between them with something that lived in the territory between uncertainty and discomfort. Boyd told Merritt he had a non-compliant individual refusing to vacate. Raymond addressed Merritt directly and clearly explaining his authorization letter, his reference number, the designated nature of the bench he was sitting on, and the fact that he had been given no reason in law for the request to move, and was respectfully declining until he received one. Merritt's expression shifted in the way that faces shift when a person understands something to be true, but finds themselves at an uncomfortable intersection between that truth and a different obligation pulling in the opposite direction. Raymond requested a supervisor for the first time. Boyd's jaw tightened. He reached for his shoulder radio. What followed had the logic of its own internal architecture, which is to say it was not accidental, and it was not the result of a misunderstanding that more information could have resolved, because all the relevant information was already present and had been present from the beginning, and had not altered Boyd Callum's course by a single degree. Boyd was a man who had spent 6 years experiencing the effective absence of consequences, and the absence of consequences does something specific and invisible to a person over time. It does not simply make them bolder. It gradually and completely removes their capacity to calculate consequences at all, so that the machinery of self-correction that most people carry, the internal check that asks whether this is going too far before it goes too far, simply stops functioning, because it has had nothing to process for long enough that it has atrophied without the person noticing. Each step of what followed was from inside Boyd's specific version of reality reasonable. He was restoring order. He was doing his job. He had a situation and he was handling it. This was precisely what made men like him dangerous. Not malice in the theatrical sense, but the complete and earnest conviction that what they were doing was justified. He stepped closer to Raymond, close enough that the physical geometry of the interaction changed from the distance of conversation to the distance of assertion, his shadow falling across Raymond's knees. He told Raymond in a voice that had dropped not in accommodation but in intensification that this was the last time and that Raymond could get up on his own, or Boyd would help him up. Raymond did not move. He said he wanted a supervisor, and that was his answer. He said it slightly louder than he had been speaking, not because he had lost control of his volume, but because he was directing the words at the room at the phones he had registered in peripheral vision with the professional awareness of a man who had been working rooms for 3 decades at the record being made in real time. Boyd registered the phones as well, and what happened inside him when he registered them was the opposite of what should happen in a professional when they understand they are being observed. Instead of the natural self-correction that witnesses are supposed to produce, the instinctive recalibration and the backing down and the restoration of procedure. The awareness of the audience seemed to confirm to him that this was a performance that required a conclusion, that retreating now in front of this many people would mean something irreversible about who he was and who had won. He reached forward and grabbed Raymond's sleeve. Raymond stood deliberately, not reactively, not pulled, but rising the way a person rises when they make the decision to rise. He was taller than Boyd by just under an inch. He planted his feet. A woman somewhere in the waiting area said involuntarily, not directed at anyone specifically, but simply released into the air, "Don't touch him." Raymond said, "What is the charge?" He said it in the level, unhurried voice that 28 years of interrogation and command had made his natural register in situations of significant pressure. He said, "State it clearly." Boyd did not state it clearly. He did not state anything. What happened instead was what happens when a spring wound tight by years of unchecked authority encounters a wall that will not move. Not a decision exactly, but a release the way pressure finds the weakest point. Not through choice, but through physics. Boyd's face contracted with the specific rage of a man who expects capitulation and has encountered something immovable instead, and he leaned forward and he spat. It was deliberate. It was targeted. It was not the result of elevated emotion finding an accidental exit. It was chosen, and it landed on the front of Raymond's sweatshirt on the left side above the college logo, dark and unmistakable against the gray fabric. The lobby went silent. Not gradually, not in a wave, but instantaneously, as though the sound in the room had been cut off at a switch, the specific silence that arrives when something occurs far enough outside the boundaries of expected human behavior that everyone present requires a full beat simply to confirm what they have witnessed. 2 full seconds in which the only sounds were the fluorescent lights humming above and the distant crackle of a police radio somewhere down the hall. Raymond looked down at his sweatshirt. He looked at what was on it with the specific clinical attention of a person assessing damage rather than reacting to it the way a doctor looks at a wound, not flinching from it but seeing it exactly as it is. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he raised his eyes to Boyd's face. Every person in the lobby who witnessed his expression in that moment would describe it differently afterward. Some would say he looked angry. Some would say he looked sad. Some would say he looked like a man who had just had something confirmed about the world that he had already known and had been in some compartment of himself still hoping to be wrong about. One woman near the service counter, who would later provide a written statement to investigators, described it as the face of a man who just won something he never wanted to win. That was of all the descriptions the most precise. Boyd waited for the eruption, for the shout, for the physical response that would give him justification and narrative. Raymond gave him none of these things. He simply looked at Boyd with the cold patience of someone who has been waiting for a different outcome than the one the other person is expecting. He said very quietly, "I want you to remember exactly what you just did." Boyd charged him with disorderly conduct and failure to comply, and told him to put his hands behind his back. Raymond stated for the room for the phones for the record being assembled in real time that he had not committed disorderly conduct, that he had been given no lawful direction with any legal basis, and that he had now requested a supervisor 3 times and been denied each time. Merit, after a visible moment, that was the most important moment of his young career, moved to Raymond's left. Raymond did not resist. He would make this point later under oath in writing, corroborated at every detail by every second of video footage and every witness account that followed. He did not resist. He went with them the way experienced people in his position go with this kind of force by choice, because the alternative creates danger and because compliance in the moment is not acceptance of what is happening. It is survival. It is the preservation of the ability to address it correctly afterward. The handcuffs clicked. The sealed envelope was taken from his hand. His wallet, his keys. Boyd walked him by the arm toward the vehicle bay. The lobby watched every step in the particular silence of people who have witnessed something they know they will remember. The automatic doors opened and the cold morning air hit Raymond's face, cutting through the sweatshirt that now had a man's spit drying on the front of it. He looked straight ahead and kept walking. The transport vehicle smelled of industrial cleaner and the accumulated human stress of thousands of previous rides, and the hard plastic seat was designed, if it was designed at all, with human comfort in mind for someone considerably shorter and with considerably less to think about than Raymond Cole currently had. He adjusted, found the least bad configuration for his arms, which were cuffed behind him in the specific discomfort he had read described in 100 incident reports, and had now personally verified from the receiving end, and he directed his attention inward. He began to catalog. It was not a conscious decision. It was what his mind did automatically in situations that required documentation, the professional habit of 28 years activating without prompting. 1 false arrest without probable cause. 2 excessive force, the marks on his wrists already forming the impact his shoulder had taken, being walked to the vehicle. 3 racially charged language specifically. The phrase "people like you" delivered not casually, but with the specific deliberateness of a weapon being deployed. 4. Failure to honor 3 explicit requests for a supervisor. Each request clearly stated each denial without legal basis. 5. The deliberate deposit of biological material on a person in custody, which had a specific legal classification that the person who had done it had apparently not paused to consider, possibly because the person who had done it had not previously been required to consider consequences of any kind. Raymond held that 5th item in his mind for a moment. He thought about the legal classification with the particular attention of a man who had spent 28 years understanding how these classifications function in a courtroom and what they require in terms of documentation. From the front of the vehicle, Boyd's voice came through the partition with the specific quality of a man performing authority over a captive audience, an audience that he believed had no means of response and no means of recourse. "Always got something to say," Boyd said. "Always got to make everything complicated, acting like you've got some kind of standing." Raymond watched the city passing through the rear window. He thought about Jerome. He thought about Jerome's box still sitting in a storage locker in the building they had just left, which was still going to be there when this was resolved, and which he was still going to collect, because that was why he had come to this building on this Thursday morning, and that purpose had not changed. He said through the partition without raising his voice, "What is your badge number, Officer Callum?" A short, contemptuous sound from the front. "Read it off when you're processed." Raymond said, "I have a memory." A brief silence. "Then let's see how much you've got to say when you're sitting and holding." Raymond continued to catalog. He noted the route through the city streets, the time confirmed at 9:09 by a bank display sign visible through the rear window, the identifier number on the cruiser, the radio codes Boyd used in his communications with dispatch. He noted Merritt's silence in the passenger seat, the specific quality of it, Not the silence of inattention, but the silence of a young man processing what he had witnessed and not yet having decided what to do with it. That silence was its own category of information. After 30 seconds of quiet, Raymond said, still without turning. Still in the same level, unhurried voice, "I would remember this drive if I were you, Officer Callum." Neither officer in the front responded. The car continued through the streets toward the rear bay of the department, and Raymond sat in the hard plastic seat with his arms behind him and thought about everything that came next, which he already understood with considerable clarity, and waited for it to begin. The booking area was on the ground floor, accessible from the rear vehicle bay through heavy steel doors, rectangular and fluorescent and without windows. The kind of room where the absence of natural light creates not warmth, but a clinical flatness that makes everything that happens there look slightly more stark than it would anywhere else, where the brightness is turned up to compensate for what the architecture has removed, and the compensation never quite works. At the booking desk sat Sergeant Vera Dunham. Vera had been with the Delwood City Police Department for 19 years. She had started on patrol, moved to administrative and booking functions after a hip injury in her 8th year, and had maintained across the full span of her tenure a paperwork error rate of essentially 0. A fact she considered her most significant professional achievement, more meaningful than her commendations, more meaningful than her rank, because it was a record of 19 years of getting it right in every specific instance, and not simply averaging out to right across the general sweep of things. She was 53 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she lifted to her face only when the text in question absolutely required it, which she treated as a matter of principle rather than vanity. She was currently working a crossword puzzle, which she folded face down without urgency, when she heard the bay doors open, because the crossword would be there when the intake was processed, and the intake would not wait. Boyd came through with Raymond, presenting him with the air of a man delivering something he had retrieved successfully. Non-compliant from the lobby, he said disorderly, "Failure to comply, run him for priors, and let's get this moving." Vera looked at Raymond with the evaluating attention that 19 years of intake processing had made automatic, the flat professional assessment that registered everything relevant before any of it was interpreted. She noted the sweatshirt. She noted the handcuffs. She noted the sealed envelope that Boyd was carrying loose in his left hand, not in an evidence bag, not tagged, which was not correct procedure for confiscated property. Entering a booking area, a detail that registered in her mind with the same quiet precision with which incorrect details always registered. She reached for the intake form and said, "All right, let's get a name." "Turn around, sir." Raymond turned. The fluorescent light of the booking area hit his face directly and fully, the way the lighting in these rooms was designed to do, to see everything, to eliminate shadow, to make concealment impossible. Vera Dunham looked at his face. She reached for the reading glasses on their chain and put them on. She looked at his face again. Her pen stopped. It was suspended approximately 2 inches above the intake form, motionless, held by a hand that had forgotten it was holding it. She had seen this face before. Not in passing, not casually, not in the vague way that faces accumulate in memory without specific context. She had seen it in the particular context of official administrative business, which meant it had been attached to a name and a title and a specific institutional significance that made it the kind of face a person who reads everything would remember. 3 weeks ago, as part of her normal administrative duties, she had processed a routing memo from Mayor Briley's office, one of hundreds of documents that crossed her desk in any given month, and all of which she read, because Vera Dunham read everything that came across her desk, a habit that 19 years of zero-error paperwork had not allowed her to abandon. The memo had contained in the section labeled Appointment Summary a name, a title, a formal headshot photograph, and an effective date. The photograph had been a good likeness. She was looking at that face right now, in her booking area, in handcuffs, with someone else's spit drying on his sweatshirt. The pen slipped from her fingers. It hit the elevated desk with a sharp, small crack that in the quiet of the booking area was startlingly loud. It rolled to the edge. It dropped to the floor behind the counter with a second, softer sound. Vera did not move to retrieve it. She whispered the name Raymond Elias Cole. The name came out the way a person confirms a disaster they have been hoping to be wrong about. Boyd, leaning against the far wall finishing his coffee, turned at the sound of the dropped pen with the mild frown of a man being interrupted during something he considers essentially complete. "What's the holdup, Vera?" he said. "Run him for priors." Vera did not look at Boyd. She looked at Raymond, and then she looked at the computer terminal on her desk, and she typed the name with the specific focused intention of a person confirming something they already know, but need the screen to verify, so that the room can verify it with them. The department's integrated personnel and command directory populated the record in a few seconds. She had it open and facing outward on the screen before Boyd finished crossing the room. Boyd walked over with the mild irritation of a man being interrupted during a task he considers already complete. He looked at the screen. He read the profile from left to right. His eyes moved across the name, across the title, across the lines of institutional information that described the person standing 3 feet away from him in handcuffs. They reached the formal headshot photograph, the official portrait, and they stopped. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Raymond. He looked at the photograph again. He read the title beneath it. He read the effective date. He read the effective date a second time. The smirk that had been a permanent feature of Boyd Callum's face for 6 years, as natural and habitual as his breathing, as much a part of his professional presentation as his polished boots and his precise uniform, did not fade. It was there, and then it was gone, as completely and instantaneously as a light that has been switched off, leaving not a dimming, but an absence. What replaced it was not fear, not bunker, not any single legible emotion, but the total erasure of expression, the blank, stricken quality of a man whose operating system has received information that it cannot process and has not yet generated a response. The screen said Raymond Elias Cole, Deputy Superintendent, Retired Chicago Police Department. Appointed Chief of Police, Delwood City Police Department. Effective Monday. 2 officers who had been working at desks across the room had been watching since Vera stood up. They read the screen from where they were sitting. One made a short, involuntary sound, barely a sound at all, more the beginning of a sound that did not finish. The other went completely still, with the stillness of a person who has understood something significant and is processing the full dimensions of it. Boyd's right hand moved toward his left palm in the habitual knuckle-cracking motion before he was aware it was moving, and then he realized what he was doing and stopped himself. And the stopping of himself communicated everything about his psychological state that his face was no longer able to communicate because his face had gone somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary expression. He tried. His mouth opened, and the first thing that emerged was not language, but the sound a person makes when they are searching for a version of reality in which they are not in the position they are actually in. He said the credential had to be fake. His voice was a full octave higher than its normal register, which in itself was information. He said, "Look at him. Look at how he's dressed. You think someone like that is actually the incoming chief." Vera's voice came down on the sentence like a door being closed. "Stop talking," she said. She was already moving around the booking desk toward Raymond, moving with the purposeful, controlled pace of a person executing damage control, not running. Because running communicates panic, and panic compounds damage, but moving with the specific efficiency of someone for whom every additional second is an additional second of institutional catastrophe. She reached Raymond and looked up at him with the expression of a professional who is simultaneously horrified and still professional, managing both things at once because that is what the situation requires. She said she was sorry. She said it in 4 words, and the 4 words carried more sincerity than most people manage in a paragraph. She said she was removing the restraints right now. Her hands stayed steady. 19 years of difficult intakes had taught them to stay steady when the rest of her could not. The handcuffs opened. Raymond brought his arms forward. Slowly turned his wrists over and looked at the red indentations pressed into the skin, the marks already settling toward bruise. He looked at them with the same clinical attention with which he had looked at the spit on his sweatshirt, assessing filing, making the record complete. Then he looked at Boyd Callum, who stood against the wall behind the terminal with the expression of a man who has discovered too late the nature of the thing he has been standing on. Raymond named what needed to happen next, and he did it without raising his voice because the room had already organized itself around him, in the way that rooms organize themselves around people who carry genuine authority. Not the authority of a title or a uniform or a position in a hierarchy, but the deeper authority of someone who has spent a career earning the right to be heard and knows how to use that right precisely. He turned toward the corridor door and said clearly without hurry, "I need Deputy Chief Holloway in this room. Right now." Vera was already reaching for the phone. Her call had the specific quality that conveys emergency without explaining it, which produces faster results than specificity because the listener understands they need to come and understand why later. The call lasted 40 seconds. Raymond stood in the center of the room and was still. He did not pace. He did not make additional demands or deliver speeches or look at Boyd again except once a single brief look at the man near the terminal that was not threatening and not performative. Simply the acknowledgement of a person completing the final entry in a catalog before moving to the next stage of the process. Boyd had sat down on the bench near the holding cell wall. It was the same bench onto which he had shoved Raymond less than 15 minutes ago, and he sat on it now, the way people sit when their legs have become unreliable, staring at the linoleum floor and saying nothing. The habitual architecture of his professional self, the swagger and the smirk and the physical ease of a man who has always been the most dangerous thing in any room he entered, had collapsed as completely as a structure whose single load-bearing wall has been removed without warning. Deputy Chief Lawrence Holloway arrived 4 minutes later with the energy of a man who has received an alarming call and is expecting something manageable. He was 48 years old, compact and careful with the particular practiced ease of someone who had navigated institutional politics successfully for a long time and had come to regard that navigation as his primary professional skill. He had been the person who cleared Boyd's 4 prior excessive force complaints through internal review. He walked into the booking area expecting a routine intake problem. He stopped when he saw the screen. He read it. He looked at Raymond, at the spit on the sweatshirt, at the marks on the wrists, at the expression of quiet absolute authority on the face of the man who would be his commanding officer in 4 days. He looked like a man who has realized the building he has been standing in is not the building he thought it was. Raymond addressed Holloway by name and rank, specifically demonstrating, without commentary, that he had already reviewed the department's organizational structure, already knew the chain of command, already understood precisely who occupied which position in the institution he was 4 days from commanding. He addressed him the way a person addresses someone whose role they understand completely and whose authority they are about to redirect. He said he had been unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, and subjected to a deliberate act of degradation by Officer Callum in the lobby of this building in front of multiple witnesses and on multiple active recordings, and that he required 3 things to happen in the next 5 minutes. He spoke without notes, without raising his voice, with the measured cadence of a man who has given authoritative direction for nearly 3 decades, and whose voice has absorbed across that time a quality of absolute seriousness that volume has never needed to reinforce. First, all surveillance footage from the lobby, the transport bay, and the booking area from 7:30 that morning forward was to be secured immediately on an isolated server, with no access granted to anyone except persons he personally designated. If one frame of that footage was missing, corrupted, or modified in any way, he would file a federal obstruction referral personally, and he would file it against Holloway. Second, Officer Callum's body camera and the transport vehicle dashcam were to be surrendered to Sergeant Dunham within the next 4 minutes. Third, the sealed authorization letter, confiscated from him during his unlawful arrest, was to be returned to him immediately. Holloway's instinct was to manage this, to suggest that they step into his office, that this could be handled internally, that he could make some calls and ensure a proper resolution. He began to say this. Raymond let him get through 8 words and then said 4. "We are done talking." The 4 words arrived with the specific finality of a door closing, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the elimination of any space for continuation. Boyd uncuffed his body camera from his chest with hands that were visibly unsteady and set it on the booking desk without looking at Raymond. Raymond retrieved the sealed envelope from the confiscated property bin and opened it and removed the official appointment letter bearing Mayor Sandra Briley's signature. The letter that had been in his jacket pocket through the entire lobby confrontation, through the transport car, through the booking area, through every moment of the morning. He placed it flat on the booking desk, face up in the full fluorescent light where every person in the room could read it. He did not gesture at it, did not make a production of placing it, simply set it down and left it to say what it said. He looked at Vera Dunham and said, "Thank you, Sergeant. You handled a very difficult situation with integrity." Vera looked at him. Then she looked very carefully at the ceiling for a moment, which was the only sign she allowed herself of the weight she was carrying. Raymond took out his phone. It was 9:19 in the morning. He had been in the building for 33 minutes. He made one call. There were 3 phones. 3 separate angles. 3 separate people who had raised their screens at different moments for different reasons and captured collectively 51 seconds of video that together gave the same event the dimensional quality of something witnessed rather than merely recorded. The clearest footage came from Patricia Oden, 61 years old, a retired school administrator who had come to the station that morning to report a hit-and-run that had taken out her rear bumper the previous evening. She had positioned her phone on the edge of the waiting area's plastic armrest, with the practical efficiency of a woman who had been documenting things for institutional purposes for 30 years and understood how to get a usable angle. Her recording captured everything in sequence: Boyd's approach, the exchange about the bench and the placard, the moment Boyd grabbed Raymond's sleeve, the moment Boyd spat, and then in the 5 seconds that followed, Raymond looking down at his sweatshirt and then slowly, deliberately, back up. The expression on Raymond's face in those 5 seconds as he looked up from the spit toward Boyd's face was the thing that the internet would spend 72 hours attempting to caption and consistently failing to capture, because what was on his face was not a single emotion and could not be reduced to one. It was the face of a man who has just been handed exactly what he needed in exactly the form he needed it, and who knows it, and who is not going to announce that he knows it. It was complete, devastating calm, wearing the face of a man who has just been degraded, and the combination was something that a caption could not hold. The audio was extremely clear. Every word audible. Every exchange. By 1 in the afternoon, the original video had 400,000 views. By 3, 1 million. By 6 in the evening, the number had exceeded any meaningful tracking, because it had reached the threshold where platform algorithms amplify, without being asked, where national media picks it up independently, where the story enters the broader culture and acquires a momentum that no single decision produces, and no single decision can stop. Mayor Sandra Briley held her emergency press conference at 9:45 that evening, in the specific version of herself that she reserved for moments requiring directness over performance. She confirmed Raymond's appointment publicly 48 hours ahead of schedule, and she stated it as a fact rather than a response to the video, which was a deliberate and important distinction. She was not announcing him because of what had happened. She was confirming an appointment already made. The video was, in her phrasing, a clarification of why the appointment had been necessary in the first place. She said what had been captured was consistent with the patterns that had made the appointment necessary. She said the incoming chief would be reviewing those patterns immediately and thoroughly. She said this in 4 minutes, took 3 questions, and left the podium. By 10:30 that night, a journalist named Deborah Waller at the Delwood Tribune published a piece drawing on internal affairs records obtained through a Freedom of Information request filed 7 months earlier for a completely different story. The records showed all 5 excessive force complaints ever filed against Boyd Callum in 6 years, 4 closed without action. 1 closed with a written reprimand that could not be located in the physical file. All 5 complainants were Black or Latino men. Deborah Waller ran the piece with every document attached. Sean Merritt watched the press conference from his apartment that evening, sitting on his couch with a glass of water on the table in front of him that he had not touched. He had been on the force for 16 months. He had come in with specific ideas about what serving the public meant, ideas that had been shaped by his uncle who had coached youth basketball for 20 years in the city where Merritt grew up, and by a high school civics teacher who had made the abstract idea of public service feel like a genuine calling. 16 months of working alongside Boyd Callum had subjected those ideas to a sustained pressure that had not yet broken them, but had made them difficult to hold with the same ease. This morning had been the clearest test yet. He had been present. He had moved to Raymond's left when Boyd told him to, and he had not said anything and had not done anything that would have changed the outcome, and he was the kind of person for whom knowing that about himself was not compatible with continued inaction. The knowledge sat in him with the specific weight of something that requires a decision, and he had spent the afternoon making that decision, going through it slowly and without the protective instinct toward a colleague that 16 months of institutional culture had been working to install in him, testing it from every angle he could find and arriving each time at the same conclusion. He walked into the Internal Affairs Division at 10:30 that evening, alone without representation, carrying a handwritten account of the morning's events that he had been composing since he got home. He submitted it. He stated everything in the sequence it had occurred without omission, without the softening language that institutional loyalty produces in accounts written by officers about other officers. The radio call. The specific language Boyd had used in the transport vehicle. The complete absence of any non-compliance by Raymond at any point during the entire interaction. He signed it and went home and called his mother. Boyd, on administrative leave, watched the same coverage from his kitchen table. His union representative called at 9:50 that evening. The call lasted 9 minutes. Boyd would not describe the conversation to anyone who asked afterward, but the quality of his face when he ended the call communicated its essential content, a specific draining quality, as though the call had removed something structural that he had been relying on, without fully understanding how much of his own weight it had been carrying. For the first time in 6 years, Boyd Callum sat in his own kitchen and could not locate the familiar machinery of his protection. He had reached for something he kept in a specific internal place and found the place empty, and the emptiness was not an absence of something external. It was the discovery that what he had been standing on had never been as solid as he believed, and that the only reason it had held as long as it had was that no one with sufficient weight had yet stepped on it. He was understanding the conditions of his protection for the first time. It was a very bad time to be learning them. State Prosecutor Denise Stafford opened the criminal investigation with the methodical precision that had characterized her 22 years in the Attorney General's office, the kind of precision that defense attorneys found genuinely uncomfortable because it left them very little viable territory. She obtained Boyd's complete complaint history within 48 hours and made direct contact with all 4 prior complainants. Their agreement to give formal statements was immediate, and the immediacy of it communicated something important that Denise Stafford understood clearly, which was that these 4 men had not been waiting for an investigation. They had been waiting for someone with authority to ask. Calvin Reeves was the first. 18 months prior, he had been pulled over by Boyd Callum for a disputed lane change on a stretch of road where the lane markings were genuinely ambiguous. What followed was not a traffic stop. Boyd had pulled him from the vehicle, cited physical force that resulted in a fractured wrist, and charged him with obstruction. The fractured wrist had kept Calvin from typing for 3 weeks, and he had lost a job interview during that time for a position he had been working toward for 2 years. The complaint he filed had been logged, reviewed, and closed without action within 11 days. Terrence Webb had been stopped walking home from a late shift at a restaurant where he worked as a line cook on a street 2 blocks from his apartment, accused by Boyd of loitering in an area where Terrence walked home 4 nights a week. He had bruising on his neck and arms afterward that he had photographed and attempted to report. His complaint had been logged, and then, according to the internal affairs records, apparently lost in the sense that it appeared in the intake log, but could not be located in the subsequent filing. David Hayward had been questioned outside a client's property while loading electrical equipment from his work van. A van with the name of his business stenciled on the side, on a job he had been doing for that client for 3 years. The physical contact during the encounter had aggravated a prior back injury and had required 4 sessions of physical therapy that he paid out of pocket. Marcus Stills had been sitting in his car in the parking lot of a grocery store, eating lunch during his break from a warehouse job when Boyd Callum stopped him without cause, searched the vehicle without consent, and left the interior of the car in a condition that required $200 in repairs. Marcus had filed his complaint with specific documentation. It had been dismissed within 8 days. None of them had been believed. All of them had been told in various bureaucratic phrasings that the matter had been reviewed, and that no violation of department policy had been found. When Denise Stafford called each of them, she told them that was no longer the finding. Boyd's first plea, offer a misdemeanor charge with no jail time and surrender of employment, was declined by the prosecution the same day it arrived. The second offer, submitted 2 weeks later with minor adjustments, was declined within the hour. The Police Benevolent Association sent Boyd a written letter informing him in language that was careful and bureaucratic, and communicated its essential message through what it chose not to say, rather than what it said, that his conduct had been determined to fall outside the scope of actions the bylaws authorized the union to defend. Boyd read the letter twice, set it down, sat across from it at his kitchen table as though it were a person delivering news. Holloway, meanwhile, had chosen to cooperate with prosecutors, and his testimony about the mechanism through which complaints had been closed became the foundation of the criminal case. He delivered it in the flat transactional tone of a man honoring the terms of an agreement he has made with complete understanding of what the alternative was. Raymond arrived at the Delwood City Police Department on Monday morning at 7:48, through the front entrance, the same automatic doors through which he had been walked in handcuffs 4 days earlier, and he moved through the lobby at the pace of a man going to work. No ceremony, no performance, no pause for the weight of the moment, because making a performance of the weight of a moment is a way of making the moment about yourself, and Raymond Cole had not come to Delwood City to make things about himself. He was in full dress uniform, 4 silver stars at the collar, 28 years of service commendations in their proper order across his chest, shoes polished to the standard he had maintained every professional morning of his adult life. He carried nothing in his hands. He passed the bench near window 6 without breaking stride, aware of it in his peripheral vision, the way a person is aware of a landmark they have examined closely and filed correctly. The recognition of what he was moved through the lobby in a wave as he crossed it. Not immediately, not in everyone simultaneously, but enough to change the quality of the room's attention. He went through the security door, up the stairs into the main administrative corridor, and into the all-hands briefing that had been called for 8:15. 147 officers, detectives, administrative staff, and command personnel in the main assembly room. Raymond stood at the podium and looked at them, and the silence before he began speaking had a quality that several people in the room would remember long afterward, not threatening, not theatrical, but inhabiting the space in a way that made everyone present more awake to what they were about to hear. He spoke for 24 minutes. He did not raise his voice at any point. He described what had occurred Thursday morning in direct, unembellished language, and said it was not an isolated incident but a demonstration of a pattern made possible by the sustained absence of meaningful oversight. He announced 3 structural changes effective immediately: a civilian oversight board with full subpoena authority, a mandatory body camera policy with 0 tolerance for individual deactivation, and the reopening of all 5 excessive force complaints under independent review from the State Attorney General's office. He stated these as decisions. He did not invite questions. Then, outside his prepared remarks, he said he had a brother named Jerome. The trial was 3 days, which in the context of a case with this particular profile and this particular evidentiary foundation was almost startlingly efficient. But efficiency was the appropriate response when the defense had been left very little viable territory by the weight and clarity of what the prosecution had assembled. Prosecutor Denise Stafford opened on the first morning, with all three videos played in sequence, three separate angles, giving the jury the experience of seeing the same 51 seconds from three separate physical perspectives, not one person's interpretation of an event, but a dimensional understanding of it. She paused Patricia Oden's recording at the moment of the spit and held it for 10 seconds in complete courtroom silence. Then she advanced the footage frame by frame until she reached the image of Raymond's face looking back up from his sweatshirt. And she held that too, and she said, "Look at his face." She let them look at it for 5 seconds. Then she said, "That is a man who has just been handed what he needed. He doesn't know yet that every phone in that lobby is recording. He doesn't know that his appointment is about to be announced publicly. What he knows is what 28 years of investigating misconduct has told him, which is that this moment is already in the record, and that is enough." On the second day, the 4 prior complainants testified. Stafford questioned each one gently and completely, ensuring they understood the process, that the experience of finally being heard did not also have to be an experience of additional difficulty. She questioned Calvin Reeves and Terrence Webb and David Hayward and Marcus Stills, and the cumulative effect of 4 separate accounts with identical structural features. The same profile of person targeted the same escalation pattern. The same institutional response of dismissal afterward was not something the defense could effectively address on cross-examination. Boyd's attorney, a man named Garrett Marsh, cross-examined each complainant looking for inconsistencies and did not find them. He sat down after each cross with the expression of a professional honoring an obligation without expectation of result. On the morning of the 3rd day, Stafford played the transport vehicle audio. Boyd's voice recorded when he believed the man in the back seat was entirely subject to his power and entirely without recourse came through the courtroom speakers in the silence of a room paying complete attention. Always got something to say. Always got to make everything complicated. You people always think the rules are different for you. They're not. They never are. Stafford paused the recording. She let the silence hold for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You people. That phrase is not the phrase of a man who made a split-second error under the pressure of a difficult situation. That is the phrase of a man describing a category he had been treating one specific way for 6 years with full institutional protection against people who did not have the means to hold him accountable for it." The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 52 minutes. Guilty on all 3 counts. When the first guilty was read, Boyd pitched forward onto his elbows at the defense table in the instinctive motion of a person who suddenly requires external support to remain upright. The second and third verdicts were read into a courtroom so quiet that the sound of someone in the gallery crying softly, not dramatically, but with the quiet relief of a long tension releasing, was audible from the press section. The sentencing hearing fell on a cold, clear Thursday morning, the kind of winter clarity where the air has a precision to it and colors are sharper than usual, as though the season itself has decided to make things visible. The courtroom was at capacity before 8:30. Calvin Reeves, Terrence Webb, David Hayward, and Marcus Stills were in the second row when Raymond arrived. He took a seat in the gallery in civilian clothes as a private citizen with his attorney Claudette Gray beside him. Raymond walked to the podium when invited and adjusted the microphone and looked at the room for a moment before he began, not to gather himself, but to allow the room to become fully present before he addressed it. He said 2 sentences about his own injuries, the wrist marks that had taken 2 weeks to fully fade, the violation of being walked through a public space in handcuffs, and that the injuries had healed completely. He stated this as a simple, fortunate fact. And then he moved immediately and entirely away from himself. He said the name Calvin Reeves. He said it with the deliberateness of a name being spoken publicly in a setting where speaking it publicly mattered, and he said what had happened to Calvin and what the department had done when Calvin reported it. He said the name Terrence Webb and said the same thing. He said David Hayward. He said Marcus Stills. He said each name and stated the same essential fact: this man trusted the process, told the truth about what happened to him, and was dismissed. In the second row, each man's face changed slightly when his name was spoken. Not dramatically, but in the small, private way that faces change when something held in silence for a long time finally enters the public record in the setting where the public record is made. Raymond said the institution failed these men before it reached me. It failed them because they did not have a title or an attorney or a 48-hour news cycle. It failed them because the people inside it had been allowed to operate without the kind of oversight that accountability requires, and that was not an accident. It was a sustained choice made over years, and these 4 men paid for it from their own lives. He paused. He looked at Boyd Callum at the defense table, and Boyd looked up, and their eyes met, and what passed between them in that meeting had no clean name, but it was something conclusive. The last communication between 2 people at the end of a story that has arrived at its ending. Raymond said, "I did not come to this department for myself. I came for Jerome. I came for the men in the second row. I came for everyone who ever sat on that bench in that lobby and was made to feel like a problem to be managed rather than a citizen to be served." He stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat. Judge Carol Marsh had been on the bench for 17 years. And had the quality of presence that comes from that kind of sustained, careful attention to the work of justice, the specific gravity of a person who has decided something important about what the process is for and has not moved from that decision. She reviewed the evidence, the videos, the audio, the 4 prior accounts, the testimony about how complaints had been closed, and she said there was nothing in any of it that supported characterizing Boyd Callum's conduct as error or mistake or lapse in judgment. The pattern was too consistent, the victims too numerous, the protection too deliberate. She said you believed the law applied to other people. You were given repeated evidence that you were correct to believe this because the people responsible for correcting that belief chose instead to protect it. She sentenced Boyd Callum to 9 years in federal penitentiary with no parole eligibility for the first 6. His pension was stripped in its entirety. He was permanently barred from employment in law enforcement in any capacity in any jurisdiction for the remainder of his life. The gavel came down. The marshals moved Boyd toward the side door, and as they did, he turned his head one final time and found Raymond in the gallery. And what was on his face in that moment was not resentment and not hatred. The contempt that had structured his professional identity for 6 years was entirely gone, replaced by something much more defeated and much more honest, the expression of a man who has finally encountered the actual weight of what he believed and found it heavier than he is able to carry. Raymond looked back at him with the same steadiness he had maintained since the bench in the lobby, and he gave Boyd one slow, deliberate nod, not triumphant, not pitying, simply concluded and done, and then he looked away. He looked at the 4 men in the second row. David Hayward was looking directly at him. When their eyes met, Hayward gave him the same nod. Not simple, not easily described, but containing within it years of waiting, and the end of the waiting, and the beginning of something that might, with sustained effort and continued work, be called justice. The side door closed. The room exhaled. The Civilian Oversight Board was constituted within 29 days. 7 members, including 2 retired judges, a public defender, a community health worker from the Whitfield Avenue neighborhood where Jerome had coached youth football, and 2 ordinary residents selected through a civic lottery process. Full subpoena authority. A direct reporting line to the city council that bypassed the police department entirely. Raymond attended the first meeting as an invited observer, not as a presiding authority, because the point of the board was precisely that its oversight would not be subject to his approval. The mandatory body camera policy went into effect 12 days after its announcement. A compliance audit 2 months later found 0 unauthorized deactivations. Raymond reviewed the audit himself and filed it as the baseline measurement against which every future audit would be compared. 3 of the 4 prior complainants reached civil settlements with the city funded entirely through the department's forfeited misconduct insurance reserve, not $1 drawn from Delwood's general tax base. Marcus Stills declined a financial settlement. He requested instead and received a formal written apology from the city on official letterhead signed by Mayor Briley, read aloud into the public record at a city council meeting, and entered permanently into the municipal archive. He said in a brief public statement that he had been waiting longer for someone to acknowledge what had happened than he had been waiting for money, and that the acknowledgement was what he had actually needed. Sean Merritt received a formal commendation for his cooperation with the investigation. He was promoted to training officer for the department's newly developed ethics curriculum and taught the first module with the particular authority of a person who lived through the example before he fully understood the material. Holloway served 16 months for obstruction of justice, was released on schedule, and has not held public employment since. 6 months after the Thursday morning in the lobby, Raymond walked back into the Delwood City Police Department through the front entrance, through the lobby past window 6, and continued past his office without stopping. He went to the property storage clerk on the ground floor, a young woman named Donna who had been with the department for 8 months, and who processed his authorization with efficient courtesy and disappeared into the back. She returned carrying a medium-sized cardboard box sealed with brown tape, the kind of box that moving supply stores sell in quantity, ordinary and practical. On the side in black marker in a handwriting that Raymond recognized immediately and completely, and that produced in him involuntarily the specific quality of grief that has nowhere particular to go, Jerome had written his own name and the date and the word truck in capital letters. Raymond carried the box to a bench in the hallway, not the lobby bench, a different one, and set it down and opened it. The first thing he found was a worn spiral playbook, the kind football coaches use to diagram plays and track player notes, the cover soft from long handling, the pages inside covered in pencil diagrams, with some plays crossed out and redrawn, and the margins full of names in Jerome's handwriting, names of boys. Raymond didn't know, with small notations beside some of them that were clearly personal things Jerome had been tracking about individual kids who needed encouragement, who responded better to directness, who was having trouble at home. He set the playbook carefully on the bench beside him. Beneath it, a coffee thermos with a dent on the lower left side, the specific dent from an incident Jerome had described to Raymond on the phone, once laughing about dropping it from a scaffolding level onto a concrete floor, and being amazed it still worked. Jerome had said he'd get it fixed. He never did. Raymond turned the thermos over in his hands and set it beside the playbook. At the bottom of the box, tucked flat and face down as though it had been placed there deliberately, rather than simply found its way, there was a photograph. Raymond turned it over. Jerome and Raymond, both younger, standing with their arms around each other, at what appeared to be a cookout from the background. Jerome, mid-laugh, with his whole body committed to it the way Jerome always was. Raymond beside him, caught in the moment just before he was going to start laughing too, the moment when the laugh is already inevitable but hasn't arrived yet. Raymond held the photograph for a long time. He was in a hallway of a police department on a Tuesday morning, 6 months into a demanding and important job, and he sat on a bench with a cardboard box at his feet and held a photograph of his brother and let the moment be exactly what it was. He did not cry in this hallway. This was not a crying moment. It was a different kind of moment, the kind where something that has been suspended and searching for somewhere to land finally finds the place. He held the photograph, and he let Jerome's laugh exist in the room with him, as clearly and as loudly as it had ever existed in any room Jerome had actually been in, and it felt for a minute like enough. He placed the photograph gently in the box on top of the playbook and the dented thermos. Then he folded the box closed and picked it up, carried it to his car in the visitor lot outside, and placed it in the passenger seat rather than the trunk because he wanted it next to him on the drive home. He sat in the parking lot for a moment before starting the engine. The same visitor lot where he had parked 6 months earlier at 8:46 in the morning on a Thursday that he had not known would cost what it cost. The morning air was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that makes everything precisely itself, and the city was going about its Tuesday the way cities go about Tuesdays. He drove home through Jerome's streets, down Whitfield Avenue, past the football field, past the electrical supply company where Jerome had bought materials for his jobs, through the East Side neighborhood, that Jerome had chosen and loved and contributed to for 11 years, and that had deserved all along to be served better than it was. At home, he set the box on the kitchen table next to the framed photograph of Jerome. He stood for a moment looking at both of them, the photograph that had been there since he moved in, and the box that had been waiting 14 months to come home. He went to the closet and retrieved the clear evidence bag his attorney's office had returned to him after the trial concluded, the gray sweatshirt from his son Marcus's college graduation fraying at the cuffs, worn soft from 9 years of use. The stain from the spit was still there on the left side above the college logo, faint but present if you knew to look for it. Dry cleaning had reduced it but not erased it. He folded the sweatshirt carefully and placed it in the box with Jerome's things on top of the playbook and the thermos and the photograph. Not as a symbol, not as a gesture toward meaning, just as an object that belonged with other objects from a year that had changed the shape of things. He closed the box, left it on the table. He stood at the kitchen window for a while watching the street, the same window where he had watched the morning proceed 6 months ago, before driving to a building he hadn't known would cost what it cost. A woman walked a dog past the building. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Delwood City proceeding through Tuesday with complete indifference to the fact that it was a different city than it had been 6 months ago, changed not dramatically or all at once, but incrementally, at great cost, one careful step in a direction that mattered. The indifference was not failure. It was the ordinary texture of a world that moves slowly and imperfectly toward the things that should have been true all along. Raymond watched the street for a while. Then he picked up his keys and his jacket. He had a department to run. There is a thing worth saying plainly about this story, and it is this. The spit was meant to reduce a man. It was meant to communicate to Raymond Cole and to everyone watching in that lobby something about the order of things, about who belongs where and who has to answer to whom, and what the badge on a chest means about the permanent geography of power. That was what the spit was for. What it actually did was hand that man exactly the evidence he needed in exactly the setting where it would do the most work in front of exactly the witnesses whose accounts would matter most. Because Boyd Callum walked toward Raymond assuming he knew what he was walking toward, and he had no idea. He never does. That specific failure of vision, the failure to actually see the person in front of you before deciding what they are, is both how it starts and how it ends. The 4 men in the second row at that sentencing hearing are the point of this story. Calvin, Terrence, David, Marcus. They told the truth about what happened to them and were dismissed. They waited. Their waiting finally ended because someone was standing in the right place at the right moment with 28 years of knowing exactly what to do with a moment like that. Most of us will never have that particular combination of credentials and timing. But all of us can be the person who stays still, who names what is happening, who refuses to give them the image they're waiting for, who remembers every detail. Composure is not surrender. It is the most dangerous thing in the room. If this story moved you, share it. Not because we're asking you to, but because somewhere in your life there is a person who needs to hear that their dignity is not negotiable, that the truth documented and witnessed has a way of arriving at exactly the right moment, and that the people who underestimate you have no idea what they're walking toward. Subscribe to our channel if you want more stories like this one. We'll be here.